Hey everybody, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, and today's episode is actually something a little bit different. So, stay tuned for that. Now, as I said, we're going to be doing something a little bit different today, and as a result, I think we probably should change the name of my channel here for just a minute and call it Classic Bike DIY. Now, for those of you who don't know, I have picked up a Giant Stance 29.2 for my first foray back into mountain biking since I was in college. And it has been an absolutely incredible hobby to get back into. For those of you who are mountain bikers, you already know, but for those of you who aren't mountain bikers, this is just an incredible way to get some exercise, but also to have a lot of fun. And if you're like me and you like to tinker on things, bikes are a great thing for that, although they are not so great as far as financial stuff goes, because you are just going to be constantly upgrading things. Now, in today's episode, I want to talk about replacing the handlebars on my bike and how to do it, the things that are involved, and, the whole process. I have already done a few upgrades on this bike, namely the front disc has been upgraded to a larger size, and I moved the disc that was on the front to the rear. Did some little cosmetic upgrades on the stem. I also got some new grips and, of course, a dropper post, which is arguably one of the best upgrades I've done so far. Now, in today's episode, I'm going to be showing you guys how to install a set of new OneUp carbon handlebars. I bought these for myself. This isn't a sponsored video or anything, but I've heard tons of good stuff about these. Namely, that you get more vertical compliance, so as you're going through a lot of rocky, kind of chunky stuff, it kind of absorbs a little bit of that judder and that shaking. But because of the larger stem size, you are actually increasing the stiffness when you're turning the handlebars and keeping your steering responsive and not sluggish. So jump over to the bike stand here, and I'm going to show you guys how to take the stuff off of your current bike to prepare it for the new handlebars. Now, looking at the handlebars in full here, you can see there's a few things on them that we need to take off first. The outer grips, these need to come off, and then the brakes and the shifter and the dropper post actuator all need to come off of these handlebars before we put the new ones on. Now, before we actually take the handlebars off, I usually like to go through and measure the distance between each of these individual items, because for me, I've gotten used to, very used to where each of these things sit on my handlebars currently. So I want to try and keep that pretty much the same on the new handlebars. So you can do that with something simple like a ruler, something like that. I have a set of digital calipers because I work on my Mini all the time and do lots of stuff that involves those. So I'm going to measure these out, and we're going to go ahead and get this in millimeters because it's way easier to work in millimeters. All right, and we're going to take note of all of those measurements, and then we can take these things off. So first up, let's go ahead and take our grips off. Depending on the type of grip you have, this may be easy or difficult. To get these off, if you ever need or have any issue getting these actually pulled off of your bike, you can use an air compressor, if you have one, and spray air underneath the handle as you pull it off, and it'll actually help dislodge all of the rubber here, because that's going to be adding a lot of friction. Pretty straightforward, but easy way to get this off. In my case, these are made to come off pretty easily. Now, depending on some of these, depending on how long your brake cables are and your various cables, you may not be able to just slide it off of the handlebars, but most of these have a clamp style mount, so you can just lift those off if you unscrew the bolt all the way. Now for stuff like this, where it has a specific bolt that goes with it, I would recommend just going ahead and tightening that bolt back in here and leaving the bolt in place. It'll keep you from losing it, which is, you know, kind of important. So this side of the bar is completely disassembled. Let's go ahead and disassemble the other side. Now you may encounter some situations where you have a mounted item like the shifter here that potentially doesn't have a long enough cable to come off. Sometimes if you rotate your bars as far around as you can, you'll give yourself just enough play to get it off. You just got to remember that when you put it back on later. Okay, and the last thing that we're going to remove here is something I've received a lot of flack for, but haters gonna hate. This is my quad lock phone mount. People have said, well, Cole, if you crash your bike, your phone's gonna get damaged. And yes, I know that, it's fine. I like having it here in case of emergencies, but for those haters, I know, but I want it there. So we're gonna go ahead and remove this as well. Now, with that out of the way, the last thing that we got to do is actually just remove the bar, and in my case, I'm replacing the stem as well because this is a 30.8 millimeter stem, smaller stem. The new one, the new bar specifically, is a larger diameter tube in the center here, so we have to upgrade the stem at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead and take the bars off first, and then we'll take the center cap off, and then we'll take the stem off. Now, just like the other parts that we've taken apart so far, good idea to go ahead and replace the bolts here, put them back where they came from. That'll keep you from losing them, and that's always a good thing to get in the habit of. Now, one pretty cool thing I forgot to mention that this bike stand has, and this isn't some fancy bike stand, but it works really, really well. I'll post a link to it in the description if it's something that you want to pick up. It has a stay for your front fork or your handlebars to help hold the wheel straight while you're doing stuff. I didn't want it so much while I was taking off all of the things and bits off of the handlebars, but I'm going to go ahead and install this now so that we can keep this in place and it stays, you know, kind of relatively straight, so it's not bouncing around while I'm loosening and tightening things, because that can get kind of annoying, as you can imagine. Now, as you can see, holds it a little bit more steady. Obviously, it's still a little jiggly, but it just is going to help us keep all of this kind of in place. The other thing that we want to do now is, before we actually take the stem off here, as soon as we loosen the top cap, the fork is going to become loose and independent. So let's go ahead and lower our bike stand down a little bit and let the wheel touch the ground so that you can add a little bit of weight to this. And now, just a reminder, like I said before, this is not a sponsored video or anything. I got this top cap from a company called Dispatch Bikes, and they make these caps that have laser etched things in them. I like the Mandalorian, so I've got this. It felt kind of cool, but they have all sorts of stuff, little skulls, crossbones, all sorts of fun stuff. All right, so there is our old stem. Gonna keep this, obviously. You never know if you want to go back to something, and it's good to keep these things around. Now, before we get into putting the new stem on, something I want to mention that was a little confusing to me as a new biker. How many shims do you want? How much spacer do you want on your fork? Well, forks usually come with a little bit more meat on these from the factory, and then they get cut down to the kind of correct height for a certain amount of space underneath them. Now, some people, if you're using a downhill bike or if you're using a bike purpose-built, you might want the stem and everything to sit up much higher, and as a result, you might add more spacers here. Now, the flip side of that is maybe you don't want that. Maybe you have a different reason you want that stem to sit a little bit lower, or you have really, really high rise handlebars and you want, to set the baseline a little bit lower. So you might want to remove some of these shims and remove some of that spacer. Now in my case, my old handlebars were a very moderate rise, and my new handlebars are a 35 millimeter rise, and my new handlebars are a much higher rise, so they go out and then up a little bit higher than my old ones did. Now that means that I might end up moving and removing some of these spacers. Maybe I'll only want one, maybe I'll want just these two, or just one in general like that. This is all kind of remains to be seen. It'll really boil down to personal preference. And we may not have a solution for this, right off of the bat and, out of the gate here with the new stem. But let's get the new OneUp stuff, take a look at it, and compare it to the existing hardware so you can see what that looks like, and then we'll get it installed. Now here is where we get to the fun part. The new set of handlebars. Now these handlebars come from OneUp, and they are a carbon handlebar, but like I was talking about before, the center where the stem is actually mounted is larger diameter here than the aluminum bar that's in front of it. Now there's a few key differences between these two, but the first thing that you might be able to notice is that the sweep up on these bars is a little bit more aggressive. I'm a tall guy and I wanted to lift up my cockpit just a little bit. I'm gonna give this a shot and see if it brings me where I want and brings me into a little bit more comfortable riding position. But it's gonna be one of those things that's trial and error. Now you'll also notice that this handlebar is a little bit wider than the other one. And that's because these come uncut. The idea is that when you get these new handlebars, you cut them down to the size that you want. In my case, I'm probably going to be running about a 740 millimeter, which should be how long this handlebar is. I'm going to double check that, but I'm basically just going to match them up because I liked the width of my existing handlebar. But something else that's pretty cool is how dramatically different the weight of these two bars are. This one is what feels like almost half of the weight just by picking it up here. I don't have a small scale, so I can't give you an exact idea of how much weight I'm dropping there. However, I think I am gonna make it up in the stem. The stem feels a little bit heavier. That said, I'm not too fussed about weight. I ride an aluminum bike. I'm not riding a carbon bike that's ultra light, so not that huge of a deal. All right, so now for the next part. We are going to actually install the stem onto the bike here. Now the stem does say 1 on the top side. On the bottom, there's nothing. And then it has the torque specs on one side of these bolts here, but not the other. Now, this is where we need to talk about the importance of a torque wrench. Especially when you're working with carbon parts. This obviously is not carbon, but the bar itself is, and having a torque wrench for that kind of job is imperative. This is going to allow you to torque things down to the necessary torque without over tightening and without damaging your bar. Now the way I normally do this is to go ahead and lift up my stem here while centralizing the bike. It can be a little awkward if I'm honest. And then I've got a few carbon spacers here. I'm gonna leave those as they are right now. We're gonna just give that a shot, the existing amount of spacers. Some people like to kind of space it out so it sits perfectly flush on the top there. In my case, I also like this. So the stem is actually a little bit thicker than my old one. So what I'm gonna do here, try removing a shim here. That's a little too far. Now, I have a few more of these carbon shims, and as you know, adding carbon parts to your bike makes it go a lot faster. It's just facts, y'all. So I'm gonna grab a few more of these shims, some that are a little bit thinner, and see if I can space that up just a little bit so it sits perfectly flush. Okay, now the torque spec on this is 9 Newton meters, and we're gonna set our torque wrench to 9 Newton meters, in my case, already set, and we're gonna go ahead and tighten this up. And when you hear it click like that, that means you're at the desired torque spec. So now, with that torqued in place, you're gonna wanna lift this up, make sure that you don't have any play in your fork, and just double check it again and make sure that it's centralized. Now, we can go ahead and install the bar. And the bar is the most important part when it comes to torque specs. Now, one thing I want to mention before we put the bar in here is that this is something called a no gap stem. And what that means is that the top of the stem is going to get cinched down all the way, and then the bottom will have a gap on it based on the torque spec. So this will get tightened down, and the top will have no gap, the bottom will have a little bit as you tighten it down to the necessary spec. So let's get the bar, we'll slide it in here, and then we can cut the ends, make it all perfect. It's gonna be really cool. All right, so now we can start to kind of adjust this to the way we want it. The bar itself has very faint marks on it to help you set the head angle. That is the angle at which the bar sits in here. And then there is a line right down the center to align it with your stem, and that will mark the center of your handlebars. So we're gonna go ahead and cinch up the top ones all the way. This is no gap on the top, like I said. And once those are in place and tightened up, we should be able to tighten the bottom ones down and get it exactly how we want it. Now, when you tighten those two top bolts down, it's actually going to help hold that bar in place. And there's something that you may notice that I did not do, and that is I didn't put any sort of paste on this stem. That is an anti-slip or anti-seize paste on the carbon bar. I didn't put that on there because OneUp doesn't specify that you should be putting it on it for their stem and their handlebars here. If I do ultimately get any movement or anything, it ends up being a problem. It's pretty simple. You just take it off and add some paste. But I'm going to run it without it first. Should be okay. Okay, so now comes the torquing of the important bolts. Now these ones are the ones that it is just absolutely imperative they get installed at the right torque spec, because if you don't, you could over cinch these and then clamp down and break the carbon fiber of your bar, which would be pretty bad. Not something that you want to do. So I'm going to alternate between these until we get down to the torque spec. That's just a habit I've gotten into from working on cars. And those bolts are tightened down, and as they say, that ain't going nowhere. Now, with this in place, we're going to double check that the steering is still spot on, and it is pretty damn straight. That is looking good. So what we're going to do now is cut down these bars to my personal preference, which I'm just going to match my old bars, and that is 780 millimeters for my ride height, my personal height, and everything. So let's do that now. Now this next part, we are going to be cutting the bars down, and it's pretty straightforward, but you can see these are numbered. So you have like 800, which is full width, 790, 780, 770, so on and so forth, all the way down the bar. Now I'm going to be cutting it to 780, and that is going to get cut at the top level of this bar right here. 800 is the full width, which means this edge. So then 790 is the next line down, and then 780. So we're going to cut it 2 lines in, basically. And a good way to do this is to get a piece of painter's tape, wrap the bar, and line it up with the line that you want to cut at. And that'll help give you a guide so you can cut it, just right, and you don't end up askew or anything like that. Now you might be looking at this and thinking, that's really not a lot that you're cutting off of your bar there. But that little bit on both sides, that's about 40 millimeters chopped off just off of the 2 sides of the bar, and it can make an enormous difference for your shoulders, for the way that you handle your bike, and of course for the small spaces that you try and fit through in between 2 trees, where you're always kind of bumping on the sides of your handlebars. It's worth it, trust me. One other thing I want to mention before cutting this is that you definitely should wear a mask. This is carbon fiber, and the word fiber should give you some clue. This stuff can get into your lungs. It's not good for you. A little bit of exposure probably isn't that bad, but why risk it? Just go ahead and put a mask on. It takes just a minute. All right, and so we're going to do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so now comes the fun part of reinstalling all the bits that you took off of your bike before. So I like to just go ahead and put these on here a little loose at first because they are going to move around a little bit. And then of course you want to put your new handlebar grips on. They are going to show you how far in the rest of your equipment needs to go. And boy, those look really good with this new stuff. I'm very excited about this. Everything is really starting to come together. Now, as I mentioned, carbon bars, torque specs are everything, and this is no different. Even your grips, every clamp, everything that's going back on this bar needs to be torqued to a specific torque setting instead of just gorilla tight. Now we get to our measurements. This is a tedious part, so I'm gonna let you guys skip ahead and I'm gonna show you guys the finished product after all of this is in place and looking real good. Alrighty, and there we have it, a OneUp carbon bar installed on this giant stance 29.2. Now there's only one last thing that I need to do and then the bike is all back together. Now of course, we can't forget the stem cap cover. Looking real fresh as well. Man, I am loving the way these new bars look. All right, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it, a brand new set of OneUp bars installed on this giant stance. Very, very excited about trying these out. Unfortunately, it is rain central here for the next, what feels like an eternity. But the next steps are really just to ride it out, see how it feels, see what doesn't feel right. Maybe the sweep needs to be changed. We need to do a rotation this way. Maybe I didn't put my brakes back on right, or the dropper post. It's all gonna be stuff that we're gonna need to try, ride it, and see how it feels. But I think that it looks really cool, and hopefully it performs a lot better than the kind of basic aluminum bar that I had on there before. Now, if you want any of the stuff that I used in this video, I did put links to all of this down below. And again, this is not a sponsored video. I bought this myself, but I thought I might share with you guys how to install it on your bike. So anyways, I appreciate you tuning in for this kind of different style video than my normal stuff. If you like these bike videos, let me know. I'll do more of them from time to time. This is my kind of like get away from everything hobby, so I'm not gonna get too deep into it, but if you like this stuff, I might do a few videos here and there. But until I see you guys on the next one, you guys know the drill. Enjoy those minis and bikes and motor on.